The top business stories live from the Sky News City studio. Apple says it will fight a US Justice Department lawsuit saying it has engineered an illegal monopoly in smartphones.
We allege that Apple has consolidated its monopoly power, not by making its own products better, but by making other products worse.
I'll be speaking to an expert to find out who will win in a showdown between the US government and the world's second largest company. Interest rates remain at 5.25%, but the Bank of England hints at cuts in the future.
We've had very encouraging and good news. So I think, we can say we're on the way.
And a report finds thousands of women lost out over the rise in the state pension age. It could cost taxpayers billions. Good afternoon. This is Business Live with me, Ian King. The US Department of Justice is to sue Apple, accusing it of using its dominance of the smartphone sector to hurt its competitors and reduce consumer choice. It is the latest in a string of the US tech giants, including Google, Meta and Amazon, to be sued by either the Trump or Biden administrations. The lawsuit, filed in a New Jersey federal court by the DOJ and 16 state and district attorneys, accuses Apple of using its control of the iPhone to stop rivals from offering services such as digital wallets. It also accuses Apple of making it hard for users to switch to devices such as Android smartphones that don't use its operating system.
We allege that Apple has employed a strategy that relies on exclusionary, anti-competitive conduct that hurts both consumers and developers. For consumers, that has meant fewer choices, higher prices and fees, lower quality smartphones, apps and accessories, and less innovation from Apple and its competitors. For developers, that has meant being forced to play by rules that insulate Apple from competition. And as outlined in our complaint, we allege that Apple has consolidated its monopoly power, not by making its own products better, but by making other products worse.
Well, this is how the Apple share price has reacted to that, currently off just over 3.5% just now. Well, joining me now is Rebecca Clark. She's technology policy reporter at The Hill. Rebecca, welcome to you. I mean, a lot of this behaviour from Apple has been known about for a while. Why has the DOJ moved now?
Right. So, I think that this is clear. It seems to be a case that they've been building for years. We heard Apple sort of push back on it recently, talking to reporters saying that this case has actually changed in terms of what the DOJ has been focused on and part of what they're pushing back on. But I think what's interesting about how this case lays it out is it's talking about things that users know about Apple, so that if you text a user who doesn't have an Apple iPhone, the videos are grainy or it has a green bubble, and trying to make that line between if that's anti-competitive behavior, both in how it's hurting consumers as well as developers and, people that are trying to use the Apple ecosystem in order to reach consumers through their apps and services.
Now, there seems to be a pattern here emerging of the US government going after the big tech giants, and in Europe also.
Yeah, this is definitely part of what we've seen, in both the past two administrations in the U.S. We saw this with the Trump administration launching similar tech cases, as well as the Biden administration. The DOJ has two ongoing lawsuits against Google. So I think this is really part of their push in order to hold these tech companies accountable for what they see as anti-competitive behavior, especially because in the U.S. there's been a less successful push at changing the laws to hold them accountable compared to the EU, which has passed some of those laws.
Yeah, actually, so, the EU levelled one of its biggest ever fines against Apple just 2 weeks ago. Do you think that's just a coincidence in terms of the timing of this move from the DOJ?
I think that we've seen globally a lot of this pressure on these tech companies and in terms of how they're acting, in terms of what they're doing, in terms of the benefit to consumers and developers. So I think that we've seen this pressure mounting both in court cases, in new rules, and sort of enforcing the existing rules to hold them accountable.
The DOJ says that Apple has actually made some of its competitors' products worse. Is it going to be able to make that accusation stick? Yeah,
I think that's really part of the core of what they're saying is they're laying out this case and saying that Apple has followed this pattern and accusing Apple of being dominant, not by making its products better, but by making other products seem less usable because they're not interoperable with what Apple's offering. I think what we can expect to see is that Apple's going to push back pretty strongly on this, as it has with other accusations, and saying that the reason it uses its rules as it does and enforces them is because of security, because of privacy, and arguing that if the DOJ were successful, it would make iPhones and other products that Apple offers worse for users and less usable the way that they've come to know.
What sort of remedies could Apple potentially offer to make this go away?
I think we will probably see Apple push back on this pretty strongly in court. Already, Apple has had to make some adjustments to things based on other rules that have passed in the EU, like changing its charging cable and things like that, as well as adjusting some of the App Store rules based on new EU rules. I think with a lot of what the DOJ is laying out, I think Apple will push back on this really strongly in the court, and especially emphasizing that security and privacy measures.
Rebecca, if I think back 20 years ago, it was Microsoft that was forever being targeted by the DOJ and by US competition regulators in this way. Eventually, they stopped fighting and they became a much better company on the back of it. They returned to being an innovative business again. Do you think Apple could learn from what Microsoft did?
I think that the Microsoft case is something that the DOJ has pushed pretty strongly, both in the Google case and now in the Apple case, and saying that this is a similar situation. I think what Apple is saying is that it's not the same situation. They're arguing that they don't have that broad user base. They don't have 95% of the smartphone market, and trying to make those differentiations there in terms of how their products and their services are different, and really arguing that the reason that they have that dominance in the market is because of their products and not because of anti-competitive behaviors.
OK, got to leave it there, Rebecca. Good to see you again. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Some other business news stories for you now. And the Bank of England has voted to keep interest rates unchanged at 5.25% and signalled that cuts could, however, come ahead. Well, bank rate remains held at 5.25%. It's the fifth time in a row that the Bank of England's monetary policy has held its main policy rate. 8 members of the MPC voted to keep rates unchanged, with one voting to cut the rate to 5%.
We've had good news. Inflation has come down. It's come down as we expected. But we have still got some way to go, particularly with what I call the more persistent bits of inflation. That's particularly the services element. It's about half the total basket of prices. That's still at 6%. Now, we don't need to see it come all the way down to a sort of sustainable level, consistent with the target, but we do need to see further progress. But I do want to give this message very strongly. We've had very encouraging and good news. So I think, we can say we're on the way.
We'll get more reaction to that later in the programme. Now, Next said today that it expects the selling price of its goods to continue to fall this year. The fashion retailer said that currently selling prices were down 2% on the same period last year, and that during the second half of this year they would be around 0.5% lower. Next also said that with UK wages rising faster than inflation, this would ease the pressure many consumers had felt on their cost of living for the last 18 months. Well, it was reporting an underlying pre-tax profit of £918 million for the year to the end of January. That was up 5% on the previous 12 months and better than expected. The shares rose by as much as 5.75% today. Nationwide Building Society has confirmed it's agreed to buy Virgin Money for £2.9 billion. Confirming details of the takeover, first announced provisionally 2 weeks ago, Nationwide pledged to keep all of its existing branches open until at least the start of 2028 and said that would also apply to Virgin Money's branches. But it said it did not intend that customers of Virgin Money would automatically become members of Nationwide for at least the first year after the deal has closed, although it said that some could do over time. The deal is expected to be worth at least £400 million to Sir Richard Branson, who owns 14.5% of Virgin Money and who licenses the Virgin brand to the lender. The Virgin Money brand is likely to be phased out after 6 years. Direct Line said today it will resume paying dividends as it seeks to bolster its defences against a possible takeover. The insurer, which has just rejected 2 takeover approaches from Belgian rival Ageas, also announced plans to reduce its costs by £100 million. While Direct Line was reporting an operating loss of £190 million for 2023, up from one of £6.4 million in 2022, although at a headline level it returned to the black following the sale of its brokered commercial business. Thousands of women are entitled to compensation after the government failed to tell them adequately about changes to the state pension age. That is according to a report published today. The Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman said a move to equalise the retirement age for men and women, first announced in 1995, had not been communicated properly. It said the affected women born in the 1950s should be compensated at so-called level 4, entitling them to payments of between £1,000 and £2,950. Well, earlier on, Sky News spoke to the chair of the Women Against State Pension Inequality campaign, Angela Madden, who told us that was not enough.
If Parliament were to give women level 6 compensation, that could amount to £36 billion, which, yes, is a huge sum. But the government have already saved £181 billion by increasing the state pension age for women. Had they told us when they first decided in 1995 that this was going to happen to us, we could have sorted out our own finances. We would have had 15 years' notice. They actually took that choice away from us.
Well, joining me now is the economist Francis Coppola. Francis, good to see you this afternoon. We should stress that the Ombudsman's recommendations carry no legal weight, but what's your reaction to what they've said?
Well, the main thing here is it's quite a harsh criticism of the DWP, talking about systemic failure, which I think many people would agree with, and not just WASPy women, disability rights campaigners spring to mind as well. And I think that's really important, and it's important that Parliament addresses that. But then there is this question of what many women perceive as the long-running injustice of the actual equalisation itself. And I think at that point, everything becomes very muddied, because what this isn't is compensation for the state pension age rise. The Ombudsman can't recommend that, and Parliament wouldn't agree to it anyway, because that would be to overturn a decision that a previous Parliament made. Now, Parliaments can overturn decisions of previous Parliaments, but the Ombudsman can't recommend that they do. What this is compensation for is the mismanagement, the maladministration of the DWP, its failure to communicate properly, and in particular, its failure to inform the women who it discovered in 2004 didn't know that their state pension age was rising, or by how much. And that's really what the compensation is for. It's not an attempt to repay women's pensions. It's simply an attempt to compensate them for some of the disruption and the distress they've suffered because of that, the failure to communicate properly.
Yeah, very good point. You make an important one there, Francis. I mean, the Ombudsman points out that not all of the people affected here will have actually suffered an injustice. Some of them will have known about these changes. Was the WASPy campaign slightly wrong to sort of look for blanket repayments rather than looking for targeted support?
I always thought that it would have been better to look for means of supporting the women who were worst affected by this. There are many women who knew about it, as I did. I'm one of the women affected. I knew about it. Many women who have good jobs, generous pensions, they don't need this money. They're angry, they're hurt, but they're not suffering in the sense of finding it hard to live. But there are other women who have really struggled during this period. And I always felt that had the campaign's gone for targeted support for women who were really struggling because of this change, they would have achieved a lot more popular support, and B, I think that the government might have been more willing to listen.
Yeah, I guess also they would have had to prove that they genuinely didn't know about these changes, which were, as the Ombudsman says, pretty well signalled.
It's this kind of communication thing is really hard, isn't it? Because, on the one hand, as citizens, we are responsible for finding out about legislation that affects us. Government doesn't inform us of every change it makes. We are supposed to find out. But on the other hand, it did become apparent that a lot of women didn't know. And it's fair to say that the nature of the changes was quite complicated, and the water was then muddied by subsequent changes, such as the acceleration in 2011. And then the Ombudsman actually discusses this, the changes in 2014, the introduction of the new state pension, the whole contracting out thing, and the change to national insurance years, all of which muddied the waters even more and created even more confusion. And it's the whole communication around that the whole way the DWP communicates things like that, I think, does need to be looked at again.
Yes, I mean, you've made this very, very important point here. This is not compensation. This is about the DWP's miscommunication. I mean, part of the problem here is that a lot of people mistakenly seem to think that their national insurance contributions pay for their old age state pension.
No, and again, this is, you could say that successive governments have kind of fostered this myth that when you pay national insurance contributions, you're paying into a pension scheme. You're not. What you're paying when you pay your national insurance contributions is you're paying the pensions and certain benefits and a little bit of funding for the NHS. But you're paying pensions of people older than you. And then when you receive your state pension, that would be paid from the contributions of people younger than you. Your national insurance don't build up a pot for your own state pension. The state pension really is a kind of welfare benefit, and it's Parliament that decides how much people receive and at what age they receive it. It's not a contractual agreement in the way that it is with an occupational pension.
Yeah, if only more people realise that. Francis, good to see you this afternoon. Thanks very much indeed. Still to come here on Business Live, we'll have a look at how the markets have done this Thursday. Don't go away.
It's unbelievable, actually, the change. I mean, before, you know, I could barely get out of bed. I couldn't really work properly. But it was, I think, even 3 days after the operation, when we were both lying in bed, feeling quite sorry for ourselves in the ward and, you know, sort of wandering around with this massive wound. But in myself, I felt amazing. Like, you've suddenly got life back. You can actually, you know, get up and you want to do stuff.
The recovery took a bit of a while for me because I'm going from 2 working kidneys, obviously, down to 1.
Yeah.
And then it takes time for that one to pick up the slack. So it took a few months for me to get back to normal, but now I'm back exercising again and feeling good.
Max was really sweet. He was so keen to do it, and I was a bit hesitant because obviously it's putting a family member, you know, through an operation just for your own benefit. And Max has kids as well, so, you know, it was a big moral conundrum. But he was amazing because he always said to me, I'm really keen to do this. I want to do it. You would do it in my position, and pushed it. I mean, as a family, we've always been incredibly close, and, you know, we're still all very close. And, you know, I don't think it's changed anything between us, you know, because...
I think if anything, it makes you closer. Now you just have that inherent bond together that very few other people do. Obviously, there are other live donors, but it's quite rare and it's quite cool.
Yeah. So now I can ski. I mean, we went before the operation and I could barely breathe and, you know, had to spend most of it in bed. But we've just been as a family the first big holiday since and felt so much better. You know, I've got a new job now. I'm studying at university again. And actually, you know, it opens up a future. You know, before it was a case of, you know, how am I going to manage even living? And now it's, you know, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? I'm ready to crack on.
If you forgot your pajamas, Emirates has got you covered.
Fly Emirates. Fly better.
Thank you.
Well, the pound has fallen after the Bank of England's latest policy decision. Here's the current picture. Sterling off by nearly 1% against the US dollar, off by nearly 0.2% against the euro. The single currency, meanwhile, off by just over 0.5% against the greenback. On the equity markets, well, this is how stocks in Europe have finished this afternoon, all of them in positive territory. Talking points today include Douglas, the German perfume and cosmetics retailer. That floated on the Frankfurt stock market today, but the shares fell by as much as 10%. The other main point of interest in Europe today has been in Switzerland, where the Swiss stock index has risen by 0.75%, and that was after this morning's rather unexpected cut in interest rates from the Swiss National Bank. Well, here in London, the FTSE 100 has finished up by nearly 2% there. A 10-month high, that is. Busy results day, and of course that big drop in the pound has boosted some of the big dollar earners. In percentage terms, though, the leading gainer today is 3i, the private equity group. That's risen by nearly 9% on an investor briefing. Meanwhile, Next, that you can see on the screen, they're up by nearly 6.75% on its results. To the downside, Reckitt Benckiser is off another 1.75% amid growing concern over its exposure to more US legal cases concerning its infant formula product. The shares are now off by more than 27% in just a week. Outside the FTSE 100, the gold miner Centamin has risen by 3.75%. That's on the back of a trading update. But Computer Centre has fallen by 2%. It had results out yesterday. Not gone down too well for some reason. They were record numbers. Over on Wall Street, well, all the main US stock indices have opened to the upside. The Nasdaq, as you can see up there, 0.4%. Quite interesting, that, given that Apple is a major component of most of the indices. Apple obviously off 3.5%, as I mentioned earlier in the programme. Another mover to mention this afternoon, Papa John's. Its share price has fallen by 5.75%. That's after its CEO defected to the burger chain Shake Shack. The oil price, meanwhile, that has given back some of this gains from earlier in the week. Currently, a barrel of Brent crude changing hands at $85.26 a barrel. That's off just over 0.75%. Well, joining me this afternoon is Hettel Mehta. She's Head of Economic Research at St James's Place. Hettel, great to see you this afternoon. Big drop in sterling, really. I mean, it was only a minor sort of dovish tilt from the bank, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think the big news was that people who've been consistently voting for rate hikes have now changed their view and are happy to keep interest rates on hold. Those two members shifting means that the vote split was only 8-1. We haven't had a vote from the MPC now for hikes since September 2021. So I think markets probably seeing that as a bit of a relief that they're kind of bedding in that neutral policy stance now.
Yeah, now the markets are currently pricing in a 76% probability of the first rate cut from the bank in June. Is that what you're expecting?
I'm actually expecting it more likely to be August for two reasons. When you look at the underlying inflation, that's still high, so you strip out food, energy, those volatile items, that's still running at 4.5%, so more than double what the Bank of England's target is. So that's a big part of it, wages obviously feeding into it. And then also we've got the monetary policy report that comes out in August. June is not a forecast month, and typically big policy changes tend to happen then. So I'd be more inclined to expect August.
Very good point. I mean, what was interesting for me in the minutes was the bank is clearly very concerned still about wage inflation, pointing out that it's still higher here than it is in, say, the United States.
Yeah, it's running about 6%. And so services inflation, the two clearly linked. For service providers, the biggest cost tends to be wages. So not surprised. That's running at 6%, so 3 times the Bank of England's target. So not consistent with where it needs to be. When the Bank of England look at their own measures of persistent inflation, that's also running quite hot. So at the moment, I think it's going to be a while before they can signal that shift to cuts.
Now, the other big macro event of the week, well, we had the BAJ on Tuesday, of course, but the Fed last night, again, keeping rates on hold, but again, dangling the prospect of rate cuts later in the year.
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of a complication for the Fed in that we have the US election in November, the timing of that. And the economy there has been running much stronger in terms of growth, even though, as you said, wage inflation is a bit lower there than it is here in the UK. But because the economy has been holding up and that disinflationary pressure is not coming through, they're in a bit of a bind. They would probably want to cut rates later on, but if they leave it too late, they're kind of running up against the election.
Yeah, I mean, I can't see any reason why they cut now in the US. I mean, things that the economy's motoring.
Yeah, I think that the danger is that if they keep rates this high and then we kind of get a sudden drop-off, that's going to be, again, problematic. But maybe some modest easing, just to take out some of that restrictive monetary policy is what they're aiming for, that fine-tuning, which historically central bankers aren't good at, but they're hoping to kind of guide that soft landing, I think.
OK, Hettel, got to leave it there. It's been ages since we had you on the programme. It's lovely to see you again. Thank you. That's it from me. I'm back again with our morning edition tomorrow at 11:30. Hope very much to see you then. In the meantime, do stay tuned. Coming up after this short break, it's the News Hour with Mark Austin. Thanks for joining me today. Cheerio.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm Mark Austin. This is the News Hour, 60 minutes of news, analysis and interviews. We begin right now with the top stories this hour. The Foreign Secretary accuses Israel of delaying the delivery of UK-funded aid into Gaza by up to 3 weeks. It comes as the United States submits a UN resolution calling, for the first time, for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Also tonight, ministers are told to apologise and pay out billions to women who lost out when their state pension